Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Israeli home demolitions, Palestinian home demolitions, to be very specific. According to the Israeli rights organization B'Tselem, around at least 140 Palestinian homes in East Jerusalem have been demolished so far this year. According to the rights organization B'Tselem, that figure is the highest since it began keeping records in 2004. On top of, obviously, all the Palestinians that would be left homeless are 127 minors who would now be without a home because of those demolitions. Now, as we know, demolitions have been a sensitive issue and an important issue when it comes to the Palestinian cause and the occupation as a whole also. And obviously, this all stems, seemingly at least, from the Israeli policy of making life very hard for Palestinians to be able to build any new structures or to be able to expand their existing structures at this time, be it just homes or be it even commercial properties as well, which B'Tselem has also spoken about in other reports also. In fact, Peace Now, another Israeli rights group, made it very clear in their report earlier on about how tough it is for Palestinians to actually ever get permission to build any new structures of such sorts. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Gideon Levy, who is a journalist. He's joining us now from Tel Aviv. We're also joined by Jeff Halper, who is the director of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. He's joining us from Jerusalem. Jeff and Gideon, thank you both for your time this afternoon. Jeff, what are your thoughts about B'Tselem's report? There is already talk about B'Tselem's numbers possibly not reflecting the entire reality, because we also have demolitions of homes of people who have been accused of crimes of any sort by Israel also. So this number is quite likely a lot higher.
Yes and no. First of all, 99% of the house demolitions are not done for security reasons. That's very important because Israel frames everything in terms of security. Everything we do is against terrorism. But in fact, there have been about 55,000 Palestinian homes demolished in the occupied territory since 1967, which includes East Jerusalem. 55,000. And in less than 1% of the cases, they had nothing whatsoever to do with security. So this is a policy of ethnic cleansing, of trying to clear the land of Palestinians, whether it's East Jerusalem or the entire West Bank, Gaza is another story, and to confine them to these little enclaves, areas A, B, little enclaves in East Jerusalem, in order to keep the land free for Israeli settlement and infrastructure building. So this isn't really a planning issue. This isn't an issue of permits, and it's hard to build, and it's hard to get permits, and it's not a planning issue. It is a political policy of ethnic cleansing, clearing the land, and Israel really is in a mopping up operation. That's why the figures are so high, because it doesn't care anymore. It's over. It has international support. The occupation has already become permanent, and Israel is simply kind of mopping up.
Gideon, what are your thoughts on that? Because, Israel feels it has carte blanche, Gideon. Then why not just make it policy? Why not just declare, listen, we don't want Palestinians to make new structures, period, and we will demolish whatever so we wish?
Wait and see. We are on the way. I couldn't agree more with my friend Jeff. It is all about a policy, and it is all about Israel losing any restraints, because until recent years, Israel was much more cautious because it was fearful from the international community. But Israel realized in the recent years that the maximum that the international community can do is a hollow lip service of condemnations. So in the beginning, Israel took it very seriously until it saw that it's totally hollow, and we have a carte blanche to do whatever we want. So we are now at the beginning, and why to declare? Go and see facts on the ground. Now, what is very important to see is that Israel picked up certain areas where the strategic goal is really to create a Palestinian free area, namely the Jordan Valley, which all Israelis seem to plan to keep it forever, South Hebron, where it's very clear that Israel wants to keep it forever, and obviously East Jerusalem, where the goal is to have maximum territory with minimum Palestinians. And you have to see it according to those guidelines.
Yeah. So, Jeff, one of the things I'm wondering is, the Palestinians have not given in. I mean, we can go all the way back to 48, really, can't we? They're a strong people, and they're standing their ground, seemingly. They haven't just all left en masse completely from this land. So, I mean, I wonder if this policy of Israel is even well thought out for its own quote-unquote security, if we were to look at it from that angle. I mean, this just creates more resentment, more hatred towards Israel, doesn't it, from people who are living within the occupied territories itself?
No, it does. And we've had intifadas and we have everyday resistance to the occupation, certainly. But, what Gidon says is very important, that Israel does not fear any international sanctions. I mean, you can criticize Israel occasionally. The Security Council of the UN or some government will criticize Israel. But as long as there's no sanctions, it doesn't matter. And Israel knows there'll never be sanctions. And so it can do anything it wants to do. Now, house demolitions don't stand as a standalone entity. They're connected to other policies. For example, the whole idea of transfer, which is another aspect of ethnic cleansing. Israel has a policy that's called selective transfer that gets to your question. And that is that you're not going to get all the Palestinians out of the country. We know that. Yeah. So Israel's strategy is to get the middle classes to leave. Because if they can leave, the more educated people, the more economically active people, the community leaders, if we can get them out, then the rest of the population are easy to control. And if a middle-class family, I don't care what culture, what country you're from, if a middle-class family knows that its kids don't have a future, they can't get a good education, they can't get a job, they can't have a house, they leave, and they have the wherewithal to leave. So we have to look at the house demolition issue also as a way of closing down options for middle-class Palestinians that then leave the country and make it much easier to control the millions that remain.
That's interesting because, Gideon, you well know the entire basis seemingly of Jared Kushner and, this entire deal of the century, as we've spoken about in an earlier show also, was the economy, wasn't it? Where they were just going to throw money at the Palestinians. So, I mean, are we then to understand that, in fact, Israel doesn't want that to happen because it doesn't want the Palestinians to actually become stronger economically so that they stay?
No, it's a very delicate path that Israel is trying to keep, a delicate equilibrium. On one hand, not to get it into a disaster, because then Israel will have to take care of it. On the other hand, to make it harsh enough for the Palestinians, as Jeff said, that at least some of them will leave. Look, Waqar, the dream that we will tyrannize their lives and then they will decide to leave is an old dream which was never achieved. And I think more and more Israeli decision makers understand that this will not happen. So I think the idea is now to concentrate in certain areas, to keep the majority in reasonable conditions so there will be no uprising, and it's working, and in certain areas to do anything possible to guarantee that there will be as little Palestinians as possible, as I mentioned before.
All right, so then, Jeff, when we go back to then the international, because both you and Gideon have spoken about, and the lack of real action on the ground to hold Israel accountable vis-a-vis these demolitions or even its other policies towards Palestinians, why do you think it is from day one that no one's really actually acted in a very real sense? Is it as simple as what we, argue that, listen, it's the U.S. veto at the UN Security Council, for example, that essentially has always protected Israel? Is it as simple as that, or is it more complicated? Is it other factors that play into this also, do you think?
There are many factors that play into it, and they change over the years. In the last, I would say, decade or two, I think I wrote a book about this called War Against the People, that Israel is using the occupied territories as a laboratory for developing weapon systems, technologies, security systems, surveillance systems, of population control and counterterrorism that it exports all over the world to countries. And so in some ways, power elites have an interest in supporting Israel because they're getting weaponry and technologies of repression on the one hand that keep them in power as well in their own countries where they're not very powerful, where they're not very popular. And then, of course, you've got all kinds of lobbies. The Jewish lobbies are very important. The Christian fundamentalists in the United States are very strong, as you can see in the Republican Party. Germany won't, has its red lines because of the Holocaust. In other words, there's a lot of factors that play different roles in different countries at different times. But Israel has been very skillful at manipulating these kinds of things, including anti-Semitism, of course, in order to cast all its policies as simply a peaceful, innocent country defending itself against terrorism and anti-Semitism and persecution. So it dovetails, the Jewish narrative dovetails with the Israeli narrative, and the Palestinians are really irrelevant to the whole story.
But the reason I asked that question, Gideon, is because do you think in some way, ever so slowly, possibly the international tide might be changing, especially when we talk about the U.S.? And I'm going to hone in on, names like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, and, those sorts of congresswomen who, ever so slightly and slowly have started talking critically of Israel as well. And sure, they've gotten a lot of blowback, but the fact that they're able to do it as sitting congresswomen, that's progress in some way, isn't it?
And you can add the candidate Elizabeth Warren, who just said a few days ago that freezing the settlements might be a condition for continuing the military aid to Israel. Look, there are changes, but they go to both directions. There are changes in the civil societies in some countries. There are changes in the campuses in the United States. There are even some changes in the Jewish communities. But on the other hand, there is this new strategy of Israel of blackmailing Europe and the United States by labeling any criticism about Israel as anti-Semitism. This is very efficient, and until now it is really remarkably successful that we are now in a stage in which it's very hard to criticize Israel in many countries, not only in Europe. Look, and there are some other interests. So if there will be change, getting back to your question, if there will be change, it will take some more time, and it must come from civil societies, not from governments. And it will take time, but maybe it will come. Right now, everything plays to the hands of the Israeli occupation and to the hand of Israel.
What do you make of this changing tide, if you with that, Jeff? Because, I wonder, when I'm looking not just at those congresswomen that I mentioned to Gideon, but also then groups like, Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, these sorts of groups are significantly active when it comes to talking about the occupation and et cetera, and, the fact that this does not align with their even Jewish beliefs, et cetera. That's important as well, isn't it? That from within the community itself, the diaspora, that these voices are now being raised?
That's right. There's tremendous support for the Palestinian cause internationally, including in the Jewish community abroad. But what's our fatal flaw, what we're missing, what's ruining everything in a sense, is that we don't have an end game. You can't be in a political struggle without an end game. And we know the two-state solution is gone. But we have not, and by we, I mean the Palestinians first and foremost, supported by critical Israelis like Gideon and myself, that say, this is the end game. This is our program. This is what we want. And the group I'm involved with is beginning to say, it's called the One Democratic State Campaign, the only possible end game today that is just and workable is to transform the one apartheid state that Israel has already created. There already is one de facto state here, into a democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens. Without that kind of an end game, it doesn't matter how supportive you are of Palestinians, how critical you are of Israel, you can't go anywhere because you have no program, you have nothing to sell. And that is the most urgent item on the agenda today, is to articulate and put into place an end game that then we can mobilize the international community around.
That's a very good point to conclude. But of course, I'll thank both Gideon and Jeff for their time today, and of course for, as always, putting this into context for us and giving their points of view on this. Viewers, it's important, of course. We started off, of course, talking about the demolitions, and it's not a new topic, certainly. I mean, even Jeff is part of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, and Gideon's written about it quite a bit as well. But it's what leads to this sort of policy and what allows for this sort of policy to now be, successively, increased and heightened at this time, because Israel feels like it has carte blanche. It's essentially being able to get away with whatever it wants to do internationally. It just gets condemned, but no one really does anything on the ground. The Palestinians essentially are just being pushed into little enclaves, as Jeff had also put. What does this mean then for peace going forward? And as Jeff there said at the end in his concluding statements, it is about the end game now. Yes, there is significantly more support for Palestine and for those who are suffering under the occupation, even on the part of Jewish communities in the diaspora, and even those really within the occupied territory, such as Gideon and Jeff themselves. But that's not enough. Again, as Jeff said, we need to articulate what exactly it is that we now want to happen, the one state democratic that treats everybody equally. We'll keep a very close eye, of course, as we always do here in Scope, at the issue about Palestine. I'll be back with my next segment, though, after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss worldwide corruption. We're going to use a case study coming out of the UK, where Transparency International, UK, has made an analysis of more than 400 corruption and money laundering cases out of the United Kingdom, which total about £325 billion worth of suspect funds, according to the organization, and it reveals the lavish spending habits of the elite as a case study also within that report. But we're going to try to discuss corruption as a whole, because it's important to understand the effects that corruption has on just ordinary people, because, these sorts of numbers that we hear and the lavish spending habits, it's not always easy to contextualize how this affects you and I, and the fight against corruption around the world, and why it is so very important for the rest of us and for our economies, etc. Let's discuss that then a bit further. We're joined now by Matt Snape, who is the Executive Director for Parliament Street. He's also journalist for Italian publication Inside Over and iPaper columnist. He's joining us now from Evesham in the UK. We're also joined by Alison Loy, who is a reader in corporate and financial law at Liverpool John Moores University. She's joining us now from Liverpool. Alison and Matt, thank you both for your time today. Alison, I'd like to start with you. I just wanted to start off with the basics, really, if we can. In your opinion, why is the fight against corruption so very important? And what do you think the effect is of corruption then on, as I had said in my introduction, ordinary people, be it in the UK or somewhere else in the world?
So I'll start off with the negative impacts of corruption. I think there are mainly three impacts. First of all, it's reputational damage, potential reputational damage for an economy. This is bad on a country's governance perspective, and if a country has an established system of the rule of law, then any reputational damage due to corruption is pretty much damaging. The second negative impact is its negative economic impact on a country, because you just need to look around at any developed or developing countries and see the impact of corruption. The cost of living is so much higher, because of offshore jurisdictions helping shelf companies hiding these assets, which is part of corruption. So it's got a very negative economic impact upon a country's economy. And finally, there is a potential national security risk if we have corruption overseas as well, which will undermine the strength of a country's armed forces and its ability to tackle terrorist insurgency. So there are three main negative impacts on a country's economy due to corruption.
Matt, when we're looking at, I'm just going to use, again, this Transparency International report as a case study to discuss this further, because when we're looking at the kinds of money that corrupt people spend, £1 million on a Cartier diamond ring, £50,000 on a Tom Ford crocodile skin jacket. I mean, for the rest of us, this sort of thing just seems so, it just seems like it's out of a fantasy novel, doesn't it? That, again, it sort of gives the impression that it's not really that bad. It doesn't really affect you and I that much. What do you think is the very real world impact, though, of corrupt practices beyond just a corrupt person spending a lot of money on buying things?
I do agree with Alison that it does give a bad international reputation abroad when individuals are spending God knows how much money on jackets made of crocodile skin or items like that. I think the UK has an outstanding reputation for tackling corruption. Unfortunately, a Financial Times report this year, published earlier this year, revealed that the UK has dropped out of the top 10 most, least corrupt countries in the world. But I think the UK needs to do more to tackle corruption, and we need to reinforce that image that we are taking the issue very seriously. So, for example, the UK government can do more to crack down on tax havens, because the British Virgin Islands is a typical example of a country that hides Russian money. So there's more to be done, of course, but the UK has a good reputation fighting corruption, and we need to keep up the good fight.
Okay, so then on that point then, Alison, if we're talking specifically then about the UK, where you're sitting as well, what do you make of the fact that, yes, it was, as Matt there said correctly, was part of the top 10 least corrupt countries in the world? What do you put it down to? Why has it fallen off that list, firstly? And what does this mean then going forward? Do you think that in many ways that at a time of Brexit and a time of, chaos in many ways politically and even really economically, if we're talking about trade for the UK, et cetera, that the UK is almost being a bit more lax in some regards?
Yes, I think there are three fundamental problems here. So first of all, corruption and money laundering are ultimately down to greed. And that's about controlling human behavior. So we can have all the legislation that we have, and the UK, as I agree with Matt, is pretty strong in terms of anti-money laundering legislation, although I will come back to that in terms of the deterrence. That's not very effective right now. But there needs to be corporate governance, internal controls and systems to control greed. The second point is about the secrecy that I mentioned earlier. So yes, we have new legislation after the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, about the tax evasion scandals to crack down on the use of shell companies in offshore jurisdictions. But clearly they're still widely used, as we've seen in the Transparency International's report. And finally, it's the deterrence implication. So legislation has to have effective deterrent effect. And nobody was thrown into jail for breach of money laundering regulations in 2017 in the UK. So deterrent has to be credible. And one way of improving this is to impose personal liability on senior managers on all sectors. At the moment, we've got the senior manager certification regime in the financial sector, so that will impose personal liability on managers and directors for failing to maintain a bank's internal systems and controls. But this has to be widened to other sectors because, as we have seen in the report, it's now schools, it's now universities, which are targets for laundering tainted money. So it's a very vast network of players in this money laundering system now.
Indeed. If I may just come in, Alison, because I'm glad you mentioned the education aspect of this. I wanted to put that to Matt too, and come back to you about that as well, Alison, in greater detail. Because Matt, as we all know, education gives one an advantage, right? So if your child, as somebody who wasn't able to get into, like, let's say Oxford or another university in the UK of great stature, then you just pay a lavish amount of money to XYZ university, seemingly, and your child is able to then get it and come out with an Oxford degree of sorts. And, we've just recently seen the college admission scandal in the US as well, as you well know, Matt, and a lot of Hollywood actors and actresses sending their children again to big universities after having paid some sum of money to get their children passed in exams, entrance exams, and or to just have their child go to that university through a donation. I mean, that all gives an unfair leg up too, then, doesn't it, to a lot of people?
Absolutely. I mean, I would have loved the opportunity to have gone to. I mean, I went to a very good university in Nottingham, but I would have loved to have gone to Oxford or Cambridge in another life. And it's quite disappointing to see wealthy individuals using their money to get their children into those world-class universities. I mean, I am all for students from across the world coming to the UK's best universities like Oxford or Cambridge, but I think Alison's absolutely right. We need to stretch out the anti-corruption laws to other individuals. I mean, since the Conservative government came to power in 2010, the anti-corruption laws concentrated on senior bankers, but that was because the Conservative government came to power in the midst of a financial crisis where the banks were blamed for causing it. So I absolutely agree with Alison. We need to stretch out the scope of those anti-corruption laws to other individuals because, as you rightly said, it's happening in education as well and many other institutions.
Because, I wonder, Alison, the argument made from the part of somebody who is very wealthy that, listen, if the university itself is willing to take this donation and have my child then enter into a program and come out with this really Ivy League, degree, be it in the US or UK or wherever in the world, what's so wrong with that? I mean, at the end of the day, it's my money. I can do as I please, and the university allows for it.
Well, surely university entry system is about merit. And donation is fine. You can donate money, certainly, especially if you're alumnus or alumna, and that's no problem with it. But it shouldn't be part of a bribery scheme to allow your daughter or son into the university because you want them to have a better education system because of the university's reputation. So that's not acceptable.
All right, very well. We'll leave there as a final word. But of course, we do appreciate Alison and Matt both for their time today. And of course, for putting this into context for us. Matt was speaking to us from Evesham and Alison was speaking to us there from Liverpool. Corruption is something important, viewers, and it's hard to obviously get our minds around the kinds of money that these rich people spend on just the most basic items sometimes. As I put £50,000, I believe, for a crocodile skin jacket. I mean, why on earth would anyone want to spend that kind of money on just one jacket, or £1 million on a diamond ring? Those sorts of things just boggle the mind, but it's beyond just things, isn't it? It's about getting that advantage, that leg up when it comes to education as well. And these are all very important factors because it gives their children, again, from corrupt money, a leg up in life on anybody else, as Alison there said, who may very well have proper merit to come out of with an Oxford degree, for example, or a Harvard degree, or whoever we may think is Ivy League. So there's a lot of different factors when it comes to corruption that need to be discussed. It's not just as simply to talk about black money versus white money, etc. Though certainly that plays a huge role in this, and certainly we need laws around the world to catch up, really, with the corrupt practices of these sorts of people. We'll keep a close eye, of course, on that issue of corruption around the world here in Scope. I'll be back, though, with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, who went in front of Congress to give testimony, and he had quite a painful exchange with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, specifically about not just, of course, white supremacist groups and their content as posted online, but also the use of fact-check websites. According to Facebook, Breitbart News and Daily Caller, very right-wing websites, as you may know, why that would be okay. Why those websites, pardon me, I should say, should be okay to be used as fact-checkers. It was a painful exchange, I say, because Zuckerberg seemingly did not have the right answers or didn't know really the answers to many of the questions that the Congresswoman was putting to him. And that certainly is troubling on many levels for the rest of us, because then we just don't know which direction Facebook seemingly leans when it comes to any content, and especially with reports now about Zuckerberg meeting with right-wing groups and conservatives to quote-unquote keep the balance in his own mind, seemingly. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Adam Smith, who is contributing editor at PC Mag UK. He's joining us now from London. We're also joined from Washington, D.C. by Rashawn Ray, who is Rubenstein Fellow at Brookings Institution. He's a sociologist. Rashawn and Adam, thank you both for your time today. Rashawn, I'd like to start with you. I'm sure you watched the videos and or watched it live. This was really painful in exchange because Zuckerberg was seemingly just scrambling and stumbling for words. This shouldn't be that hard for a Facebook CEO to be responding to seemingly very basic questions. What did you make of it?
I mean, when I seen Mark Zuckerberg's testimony, and this isn't the first time that he's engaged in testimony like this, where he didn't have responses or it seemed like he was hiding something. At the end of the day, this is about the inability for the U.S. government and governments around the world to regulate an unregulated social media market. Right now, social media and technology are operating as the Wild Wild West, as primarily white settlers were heading west, claiming Native American land, Mexican land, and we're seeing that with technology. So his lack of answers is simply because he is a tech entrepreneur. He is a business person. He's an innovator. He's not a person who necessarily regulates a particular market. So the responses to these questions should actually be coming from the federal government, as we need more regulation. The other part, of course, is the unfair and inequitable targeting, particularly of the Black community in the United States with false information. And part of what we're seeing, to be blatant about it, is the fact that white supremacists are actually able to market and post things. But you have individuals who are engaging in counter protest, who are African American, who are being restricted from their content on Facebook and Instagram and the like, who don't have the same equitable rights to post counter protest.
Adam, I wonder of that because Rashawn is right in the sense that, obviously, I imagine Zuckerberg just sees himself as a tech entrepreneur, certainly. But do you think that it is now the time for countries around the world, let me put it this way, to regulate social media more? Because it does seem like it is the Wild Wild West where a lot has been allowed to happen till now. How does that move forward then, do you think?
I would agree. And I think one of the other issues is that Facebook, as a US company, is built upon US ideals, namely the First Amendment and freedom of speech, which is something that doesn't exist in Europe in the same way and certainly doesn't exist in the rest of the world in the same way. Zuckerberg, I think, believes that if he holds liability for the advert, for fact-checking the adverts of the platform, then Facebook moves from a social media platform to a publisher, and therefore he has to have responsibility for the truth. Now, the debate is whether that should or shouldn't happen. But in Zuckerberg's mind, and I think in the mind of a lot of Americans perhaps, if you just have a range of voices uncensored, then the truth will out just from the actions of the community. And that's something that we certainly haven't seen in society. It's certainly something that we haven't seen on Facebook with regards to election interference, with regards to anti-vaccination propaganda. And I think it's something that governments in general, I don't think governments in the United States will do this, but governments in general really need to start thinking about cohesively and with nuance. It's a nuanced situation. Too much power towards a government hand can obviously go wrong, but too much power in Facebook's hands, as we currently have it, is also not good for society as a whole.
Indeed, and that's the challenge, isn't it, Rashawn? Because you don't want, certainly, the U.S. government being the one to dictate to the rest of us what is and is not acceptable content. Neither do we want Facebook to have that kind of power. How does one then find a balance? Because, you spoke about, African Americans and a lot of the content that may be directed towards them online as being, incorrect, obviously, and misinformation, et cetera, especially when it comes to elections and stuff. And I believe Ocasio-Cortez, in part, asked about, ads directed towards the African American community within the U.S., and Zuckerberg stumbled on that question too. But then we also have then pro-Palestine groups, for example, Rashawn, that are their pages shut down because, again, it's just about wanting only one sort of content. Who should decide what is acceptable online?
I think that, my position is that the federal government needs to regulate this. So it doesn't necessarily have to be deciding what is appropriate to be online. But currently, we don't necessarily have regulations. And I can speak from my own experience on Facebook and Instagram. And I think this is what's key for individuals to realize. When you look at general trends and who uses social media, it's about similar in the United States when it comes to Facebook. But when it comes to Instagram and Twitter, for example, African Americans are much more likely than whites and Latinos to use those platforms. So when we see targeting or cross-pollination, as people know, Facebook also owns Instagram. So when you put an ad together and you put it on Facebook, you can also cross-pollinate with Instagram. So it doesn't simply become about Facebook. Then we have transference to other social media platforms. And as these advertisements are popping up, they're influencing people. And when it's false information, people actually have to take responsibility for that. In this case, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook as an entity has to take responsibility for that. And I think the other thing that's interesting, part of what could be happening while you have certain politicians like AOC and others who are pushing for more regulation, you have other politicians who actually like the Wild Wild West because they appreciate what happened in 2016 with Cambridge Analytica and their ability to target certain groups. The problem, again, is that that targeting becomes inequitable. So there are certain people's ability to be able to target and others can't. From my own experience, there have been times where, as a person who studies race relations and other topics, that I've posted things about racism and about policing, and my content has been scraped. It hasn't been allowed to be disseminated in the way that I might push out something else that say that isn't necessarily focused on one of those controversial topics. So I think that is the key problem. It's not simply about it being the Wild Wild West. It's the fact that certain people and certain content is being regulated, while other content, oftentimes alt-right, right-wing type of content and white supremacist content is being allowed.
You know, Adam, during this Congress testimony, I don't remember who it was, but one of the Congresswomen, she had mentioned, if I'm not mistaken, the breakup of Facebook. And this has been spoken about before, of course, that I'm sure you know of, that Facebook is simply too big and too influential and too powerful. And it needs to be broken down simply for the fact that it is that powerful and influential. And I'm speaking politically speaking, of course, around the world, and not just, of course, within the US or even Europe, but just it has huge influence in the entire world, really. Do you think that that is the way to go? Because, I mean, something needs to give, right? When it comes to this issue of if governments do not deal with this situation and regulate, then at some level, though these are just tech companies, we can argue, sure, it's not necessarily their job to police all the content, but it sort of really is, isn't it?
I think that certainly from a US perspective, that would be something that they're promoting. The US has a very free market, competitive ideology. And I think the idea that having a competitor to Facebook, it was Instagram, it's now bought by Facebook, would be a solution. I believe it was Elizabeth Warren, and I believe Bernie Sanders is also suggesting that. But if we're talking specifically about, say, advertisements and the idea of lying, as Zuckerberg was questioned on, there are actually other solutions that you could do. For example, I am a journalist. If you go to my website, if you go to PC Mag, we do not micro-target content. You come and you get the content that we decide to promote globally, essentially. That is something that Facebook could do. Facebook is working with journalists. Facebook has its fact checkers. If people are worried about micro-targeted advertisements being sent to specific users to promote disinformation, a good way of stopping that would be to turn off micro-targeting in those areas. Now, Facebook isn't going to want to do that because it makes it less profitable. But, as we all know, what is profitable is not always what is for the best. Another thing they could do simply is actually talk to a diverse range of voices. I believe it was The Intercept that reported that while Mark Zuckerberg may have spoken to right-wing media personalities and influencers, he hasn't spoken to, say, the editor of Jacobin or the editor of Mother Jones. And they would have the criticisms, they would have points to be made that Zuckerberg could take in and then have the answers for people like Ocasio-Cortez, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, when these questions are asked. I think, once again, it is astounding that one of the most powerful people in the world just simply has not recognized these views from a rising leftist political ideology in both the US and across the world. It's something that he needs to do. And I don't know, well, I have ideas of why he's not doing it, but I can't say for certain. It's astounding that he's not, however.
Yeah, so Rashawn, it is genuinely astounding because, you would imagine that Zuckerberg should have been briefed at least by his own team on these issues if he himself does not know the answers. But, I imagine, at some level, Rashawn, that social media was meant to be a platform of free exchange of ideas, right? And that seems to be changing quite drastically, isn't it? Where it's just very propagandistic content, if I may even use that term, directed towards certain people. It's very directed content now almost, where it's just, we're all seemingly just seeing content that that somebody has decided that we should be seeing.
Yes, I mean, social media, I think, is powerful. So I've done a lot of research on social media, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, actually analyzing tweets, analyzing content. We published a series of articles in Ethnic and Racial Studies, which is published in the UK. It's one of the top race journals. And one of the things that we discovered is that social media allows for people to circumvent traditional channels of communication. So, and it also allows for, say, journalists and researchers and policymakers to communicate with the general public in ways that they couldn't before. So, I mean, in that regard, it's extremely, extremely important. I don't necessarily think that it should go away. I'm not a big fan of necessarily separating certain types of things, but I am a proponent of certain types of regulation. And so when it comes to free speech, that makes a lot of sense. The problem is that free speech actually isn't being had. So I've done, again, some analyses, and when you use certain statements like racism, white supremacy, Black Lives Matter, your content gets restricted. But if you use words like alt-right and other sorts of words, then your content doesn't get restricted. And I think people have figured out that Facebook's algorithm is set up this way. And what happens is when people report content, I think that's the other thing. Facebook's reporting mechanism is problematic. So what they currently do is if anyone reports your content, they simply remove your content at that moment. They take about a week, 3 to 7 days oftentimes to do some type of investigation. And by that time, whatever you were trying to talk about in the 24-hour media cycle was over. Twitter, on the other hand, which is something we haven't talked a lot about, doesn't have that same regulation. It allows for people to continue to have a discussion, to continue to continue to post, but it doesn't necessarily restrict content in a different way. And so we have models out here that exist. And I think that's one of the reasons why Facebook hasn't been able to acquire Twitter, which is something they've been trying to do. And I think it's because these platforms actually have different types of regulations internally that lead to some of the outcomes that we see.
Very well. We'll leave there as a word, but of course, Rashawn and Adam, we appreciate your time today and of course for your expert insight on this very important topic. Social media is extremely powerful. Facebook is still the king of kings when it comes to social media and is hugely influential, especially since it acquired Instagram as well. It's been able to influence elections certainly as well, if we are to agree with the reports that have come out regarding Russian meddling or other countries meddling in U.S. elections or other elections around the world, really. But it's also about the ties now that Zuckerberg himself has to possibly conservative groups, or at the very least, if he's saying that he's meeting with conservative groups of some sort, does that really give him balance or does that give him bias? And what of then white supremacist content on Facebook? I mean, there's so much to discuss. There's a lot of content to discuss, and the direction of political ads and what political ads would be allowed and to what target, as Ocasio-Cortez had put to Zuckerberg during that congressional testimony. Why would African Americans be allowed to be targeted but not other groups? I mean, just this completely convoluted, confused policy on the part of Facebook, and even Zuckerberg really wasn't able to answer many of those questions, even as Facebook CEO, and that is certainly very worrying. We'll keep a close eye on that because certainly I imagine this is not the last time that we're going to see discussion about social media and its effect on politics. And just before I sign off, and it's not lost on me the irony of this, please do check out Indus News' social media. We're at indus.news, the word dot, on all the social media websites that you can think of. Please do check us out there and follow us and like our content, of course. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.